The year is 1850. A relentless Iberian sun beat down on the parched earth of rural Andalusia, baking the red clay roads into a fine, suffocating dust. For weeks, a disquieting silence had settled over the Convent of Santa Clara, nestled amongst ancient olive groves on the outskirts of a small, devout village. The rhythmic tolling of its bells, once a comforting heartbeat of the community, had ceased. The familiar procession of nuns to the nearby chapel, their hushed hymns carried on the wind, was no more. An unnerving stillness had replaced the daily rituals, and with each passing day, a palpable dread tightened its grip on the villagers. Father Mateo, a man whose faith was as sturdy as the ancient oaks that dotted the landscape, felt the weight of this silence more acutely than most. His mornings were now punctuated by the anxious whispers of his parishioners, their eyes wide with unspoken fears. "Father, have you heard from the sisters? Is it a plague? God forbid, but is something unholy afoot?" He had tried to calm them, attributing the silence to a possible illness or a period of intense spiritual retreat. But even his own conviction wavered as days turned into weeks. On this particular sweltering afternoon, the air hung heavy and still, promising a storm that never seemed to break. Father Mateo, accompanied by two of the village's most stalwart men, Pedro, a grizzled farmer, and Miguel, a young, earnest carpenter, made their way up the winding path to the convent. The usual chirping of cicadas was strangely absent, replaced by the faint, unsettling creak of the dry leaves under their worn boots. The convent walls, once a symbol of peace and piety, now loomed, silent and foreboding. As they approached the massive wooden gates, carved with intricate religious motifs now faded by time and weather, a chill snaked up Father Mateo's spine despite the heat. He knocked, the sound echoing hollowly in the profound quiet. No response. He knocked again, harder this time, his knuckles stinging. Still nothing. Pedro, a man of action, tried the latch. To their surprise, it yielded with a soft click. The heavy gates swung inward with a groan, revealing a courtyard overgrown with weeds. The scent of dust and something else, something subtly sweet and cloying, hung in the air. A lone, wilted rosebush clung to life near a dry fountain, its petals drooping like tearful eyes. A sense of desertion, profound and absolute, permeated the very stones of the place. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing too loudly in the oppressive stillness. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, pressing down on them, stealing their breath. Father Mateo led the way towards the main building, his hand instinctively gripping the rosary tucked into his vestment. The double doors to the convent's interior stood slightly ajar. A faint, almost imperceptible draught stirred the dust on the polished stone floor. As they entered the central hallway, a chill swept through them, not of cold, but of an inexplicable dread. The air grew thicker, heavier, laden with that same peculiar, sweet scent. It was the smell of lilies, perhaps, but mixed with something else, something metallic and strangely familiar, yet they couldn't quite place it. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the dimly lit corridors. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the grimy stained glass windows, casting distorted, ethereal patterns on the walls. The air was unnaturally still, the only sound the pounding of their own hearts. They passed the refectory, its long wooden tables still set with overturned bowls and mugs, as if the sisters had simply vanished in the middle of a meal. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat on one table, covered in a fine layer of dust. The kitchen was equally abandoned, a half-peeled potato on a cutting board, a forgotten pot on the cold hearth. It was as if time itself had paused within these walls. The chilling realization dawned on them. This wasn't an evacuation or a retreat. This was an abrupt cessation of life, a sudden halt to all activity. The feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation on the back of their necks even though there was no one in sight. The sweet, cloying scent became more pronounced, a sickly perfume filling their lungs. Fear, cold and sharp, began to truly set in. What terrible secret did these silent walls conceal? If you're intrigued by the mystery of Santa Clara Convent, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this unsettling story. Remember, this is a fictional story. Their search led them deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of Santa Clara. Each door they passed was either ajar or easily opened, revealing more untouched rooms, more signs of an abrupt halt to daily life. The air grew heavier, the strange, sweet scent more dominant, making their heads throb faintly. Pedro, a man who rarely showed fear, kept glancing over his shoulder, his calloused hand resting on the hilt of his work knife. Miguel, younger and less hardened, clutched a small crucifix, his face pale with trepidation. They checked the common rooms, the library, where books lay open on lecterns, as if a nun had simply walked away mid-sentence. The infirmary, where neat rows of empty beds stood, ready for patients who never arrived. The meticulous order of the convent, juxtaposed with the sudden abandonment, created a jarring sense of unease. It was as if a meticulous play had been interrupted mid-performance, the actors frozen in place, only to vanish. Finally, they reached the dormitory, a long hall lined with individual cells, each barely large enough for a cot and a small prayer kneeler. The light here was even more dim, filtered through narrow, high-set windows. A profound silence, deeper than any they had yet encountered, reigned. Father Mateo pushed open the first door. Inside, a nun lay peacefully on her cot, covered by a thin blanket. Her eyes were closed, her hands clasped loosely over her rosary. She looked as if she was simply asleep. He whispered her name, Sister Agnes, but received no response. He gently touched her arm. It was cold, unnaturally so, but not rigid. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. A wave of profound shock washed over him, a cold dread that eclipsed his earlier unease. He moved to the next cell, and the next. The scene repeated itself. 28 women, all the nuns known to reside in Santa Clara, lay in their beds, each in a state of serene, unmoving sleep. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no visible injuries. Their faces were peaceful, almost beatific, as if they had simply drifted off into an eternal slumber. The sweet, cloying scent was strongest here, a sickly sweet floral mixed with something that Father Mateo now identified with chilling certainty. The faint, metallic tang of death, masked by the overwhelming perfume. Pedro and Miguel, who had been following closely, watched in stunned silence as Father Mateo checked each one. Their initial fear gave way to bewildered horror. They're all gone, Father." Pedro's voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. "But how? There's no blood, no signs of a struggle. It's impossible." Miguel sank to his knees, crossing himself repeatedly, tears welling in his eyes. "Dios mío, what kind of evil is this?" Father Mateo stood amidst the silent sleepers, his mind reeling. 28 lives extinguished without a trace of violence, without a sound. He ran his hand over his face, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. His theological training offered no explanation for such a phenomenon. A natural illness, a shared affliction, would surely show some outward symptoms, some sign of distress. But these women looked merely asleep. It was the unnaturalness of their perfect slumber that truly disturbed him. It was a silence deeper than death, a stillness that defied all understanding. He noticed a small, intricately carved wooden box on the nightstand beside the Mother Superior's bed. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside, nestled on a velvet cushion, was a single withered black rose, its petals brittle and dry. Beneath it, a small, faded parchment scroll. He carefully unrolled it. The elegant script, though faint, was still legible. It was a diary entry, dated several weeks prior to their arrival. The Mother Superior's hand. The whispers grow louder each night. A cold presence, a heavy cloak upon our souls. Sister Agnes speaks of dreams, vivid and troubling, of endless darkness and a sweet, suffocating fragrance. Others report the same. We pray without ceasing, but the feeling of being watched, of something unseen drawing ever closer, persists. Our sleep offers no solace, only a deeper descent into this shared dread. May God have mercy on us, for truly, we feel ourselves slipping away, one by one, into a quiet that promises no awakening. Father Mateo read the entry aloud, his voice trembling slightly. Pedro and Miguel listened, their faces etched with a dawning horror. The Mother Superior's words painted a picture of a gradual, insidious descent into whatever had claimed them, not a sudden event. It hinted at something unseen, something psychological that had preyed upon their minds, robbing them of their very will to wake. The sweet scent, the peaceful faces, the complete lack of struggle, it all began to twist into a more sinister pattern, a kind of death that preyed not on the body, but on the very essence of consciousness. The convent, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, where the inhabitants had willingly or unwillingly embraced their final rest. The mystery had deepened, becoming far more chilling than any simple act of violence. What force, unseen and unheard, could lull 28 souls into an eternal slumber? The news of the discovery at Santa Clara spread through the village like wildfire, carried by Pedro and Miguel's terrified accounts. Fear, once a murmuring undercurrent, now erupted into outright panic. The villagers, already superstitious and devout, saw the convent as a place touched by an unknown. Children were kept indoors, doors were barred at dusk, and the nightly prayers became more fervent, desperate pleas for protection. Father Mateo, though deeply shaken, understood his duty. He dispatched messengers to the nearest city, requesting assistance from the authorities and medical experts, though he harbored little hope of a scientific explanation for such a bizarre tragedy. He knew instinctively that this was beyond the realm of common maladies. He returned to the convent, accompanied by a handful of brave, if trembling, villagers to prepare the deceased for proper burial. The task was grim. Moving the inert bodies, so eerily peaceful in their eternal sleep, was a disturbing experience. Each nun's face, devoid of struggle or pain, seemed to mock their frantic search for answers. The sweet, cloying scent, though less potent outdoors, clung to their clothes and hair, a persistent reminder of the silent horror within the convent walls. The villagers whispered amongst themselves, their theories ranging from a divine curse to a demonic possession. Father Mateo, while not dismissing the spiritual, was convinced there was a more tangible, albeit elusive, explanation. The Mother Superior's diary entry gnawed at him, the mention of whispers and a cold presence suggesting something psychological, a creeping dread that had infiltrated their minds. During the somber preparations, a small detail caught his attention. Sister Emilia, one of the younger nuns, known for her meticulous nature, had a small, hand-stitched sampler lying beside her bed. It depicted a blooming white lily, but the threads used were unusually dull, almost faded. Upon closer inspection, he noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible discoloration on the linen beneath it, a faint, yellowish stain. It was insignificant, barely visible, but in a place where everything spoke of unnatural stillness, even the smallest anomaly felt important. He carefully folded the sampler and slipped it into his pocket, a silent promise to investigate. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Father Mateo addressed his congregation. His voice, usually strong and resonant, was heavy with grief and confusion. He spoke of faith, of resilience, and of the need for unity in the face of the unknown. He warned against panic and superstition, urging them to put their trust in God, but also to remain vigilant and rational. His words, however, did little to dispel the palpable fear that hung in the air. The villagers looked at him, their eyes full of a desperate hope for answers he simply did not possess. After the service, as the last of the parishioners hurried home, seeking the false comfort of barred doors, a young woman named Isabella approached Father Mateo. Isabella was the village's unofficial herbalist, a quiet woman with keen eyes and a deep understanding of the natural world. She was often viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion by the more traditional villagers, but Father Mateo trusted her keen intellect. "Father," she began, her voice low, "I heard what happened. My heart aches for the sisters." She paused, her gaze distant. "That scent you described, the sweet, cloying smell, mixed with something else. It sounds familiar." Father Mateo's eyes widened. "Familiar? How so, Isabella?" She hesitated, then elaborated. "My grandmother, she taught me about many plants, some common, some less so. There is a certain fungus, a parasitic one, that grows in the damp, dark places. It affects certain flora, causing them to release an intensely sweet, almost sickeningly potent aroma as they decay. And in its later stages, it can release spores that, when inhaled in large quantities, are said to induce a deep lethargy, a profound sleep that can lead to death. It's rare, extremely rare, but I remember her warning me about its potency. She called it the sleeper's bloom." A shiver ran down Father Mateo's spine. A fungus? It seemed so mundane, yet so terrifyingly plausible in its effects. No mystical curse, no demonic possession, but a silent, unseen killer growing within the very walls that once offered sanctuary. The Mother Superior's diary spoke of a cold presence and a slipping away. Perhaps not a spiritual entity, but the insidious effect of an airborne toxin, slowly incapacitating the nuns. The faint, yellowish stain on Sister Amelia's sampler, too, suddenly took on a new significance. Could it be a residue from this sleeper's bloom? "Isabella," Father Mateo said, his voice urgent, "can you find this fungus? Can you identify it if we return to the convent?" Isabella nodded slowly, her expression grim. "I can try, Father. But if it is what I suspect, it thrives in darkness and dampness. We would need to look in the deepest, oldest parts of the convent, places perhaps long untouched by light." A new, terrifying path to understanding had opened. The mystery wasn't in supernatural forces, but in the insidious power of the natural world, a hidden danger within the very stones of the convent. The silence of Santa Clara was not merely the absence of life, but the silent, deadly work of an unseen enemy, slowly claiming its victims. The village was terrified of the unknown, but Father Mateo now felt a flicker of hope, a tangible lead in a terrifying puzzle. The next morning, armed with lanterns and a renewed sense of purpose, Father Mateo, Isabella, Pedro and Miguel returned to the Convent of Santa Clara. The villagers watched them go, a mixture of fear and hopeful anticipation in their eyes. The air within the convent still held that cloying, sweet scent, but now, knowing Isabella's theory, it no longer felt like a mere perfume but a warning. Isabella led them directly to the convent's cellars, a part of the building rarely used except for storage. The entrance was a heavy wooden trapdoor, almost hidden beneath a dusty tapestry in a forgotten corner of the main hall. As Pedro and Miguel struggled to lift it, a musty, damp smell, distinct from the sickly sweet one above, wafted up. The darkness below was absolute, deeper than the dim light of the upper floors. Descending the stone steps, their lantern light cut through the gloom, revealing a vast, subterranean space. The air here was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Cobwebs, thick and ancient, draped from the arched ceilings like ghostly shrouds. Storage shelves, once laden with provisions, stood empty and decaying. It was a place untouched by human hands for what seemed like decades. "This is where such a fungus would thrive," Isabella murmured, her eyes scanning the dark corners. "It needs consistent dampness and no light." They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast space. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen debris and pools of stagnant water. As they ventured deeper, the peculiar sweet scent that had permeated the convent grew stronger, blending with the earthy smell of the cellar. Isabella held her lantern high, meticulously examining the walls and floor. Then she stopped, a gasp escaping her lips. In a particularly damp and dark corner, where the stone wall met the earthen floor, something glowed faintly in the dim light. It wasn't a glow of its own making, but rather the way the light reflected off a strange, iridescent patch on the wall. As they drew closer, the sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. A thick, web-like network of white and yellow mycelium had spread across a section of the wall and floor, pulsating faintly as if alive. From this network sprouted dozens of small, almost ethereal-looking fungi. They were delicate, bell-shaped, and a ghostly white, with translucent caps that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly sheen. But what truly struck them were the small, almost microscopic spores that constantly drifted from their caps, catching the lantern light like shimmering dust motes. And the smell. Here, it was overwhelming, a concentrated wave of that cloying sweetness, laced with a faint, almost imperceptible bitterness that made their throats constrict. "This is it," Isabella whispered, her voice tight with awe and dread. "The sleeper's bloom. I've only ever seen drawings, but the description, it's unmistakable. The spores are airborne. When inhaled in large quantities, they gradually affect the nervous system, inducing a deep, irreversible sleep." Father Mateo felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was the silent killer, not a ghost, not a demon, but a biological weapon, growing unnoticed beneath their very feet. The subtle, sweet scent they had dismissed as mere mustiness or flower perfume was, in fact, the signature of death. The Mother Superior's diary entry, slipping away one by one, suddenly made chilling sense. The nuns, breathing in these invisible spores day after day, had slowly succumbed, their bodies entering a deep final slumber, while their minds, perhaps, experienced the dreams and endless darkness she described. Pedro and Miguel stood frozen, their faces a mixture of fear and profound understanding. The unholy presence the villagers feared was not supernatural, but a testament to nature's grim indifference. The faint yellowish stain on Sister Amelia's sampler. It must have been a residue of the spores that had fallen onto her fabric. The nuns, living in close quarters, breathing the same air, had all been equally vulnerable. But how could it have grown so large, so unnoticed? Father Mateo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella pointed to a small, almost imperceptible crack in the stone wall near the base where the fungus thrived. Perhaps a leak, a constant source of moisture. And the convent is old. Little sunlight reaches this far down. It's the perfect environment for it to flourish undisturbed, slowly releasing its deadly cargo into the air ducts, the very ventilation system of the convent. The implication was horrifying. The convent's design, meant to protect and nurture, had inadvertently become a conduit for its silent destruction. The air they had been breathing on the upper floors, diluted perhaps, but still potent enough over time, had led to the tragic fate of the nuns. The mystery wasn't about what happened, but how it could have gone so unnoticed, so silently, for so long, to claim so many lives. The convent, a symbol of piety, had become a chamber of silent, suffocating death. If you're captivated by the unfolding mystery of Santa Clara Convent, make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up with the revelations. Remember, this is a fictional story. The discovery of the sleeper's bloom in the convent cellar brought a chilling clarity to the tragedy, yet it also opened a new dimension of questions. How did a fungus so rare, so deadly, manage to proliferate to such an extent? And why had no one, not even the Mother Superior, identified the source of the insidious scent until it was too late? The sweet, cloying perfume, once dismissed as a minor oddity, now held the terrifying weight of 28 silent deaths. Father Mateo and Isabella, with the reluctant but steadfast help of Pedro and Miguel, began a meticulous investigation of the convent's ventilation system. The convent, like many old Spanish buildings, relied on a network of narrow interconnected air shafts and vents to circulate air, especially crucial in the hot Andalusian climate. They traced the path of these hidden conduits, their faces grim, realizing that the spores from the cellar were likely drawn upwards, silently permeating every corner of the convent. They found that a significant vent directly above the largest patch of sleeper's bloom led directly to the nuns' dormitory, the refectory, and the chapel, the very places where the sisters spent most of their time. The airflow, designed to bring fresh air, had instead become a silent, deadly delivery system for the toxic spores. The Mother Superior's diary entries, detailing whispers and dreams, were no longer abstract fears, but the very real physiological effects of the inhaled toxins, clouding the nuns' minds and slowly drawing them into an inescapable slumber. Isabella, with her extensive knowledge of local flora and fungi, explained that the sleeper's bloom, while rare, was not entirely unknown in secluded, damp ecosystems. It thrived on decaying organic matter and could remain dormant for long periods until conditions were just right. A consistent source of moisture, absolute darkness, and perhaps a sudden influx of a specific nutrient. She theorized that a recent, unusually heavy rainy season, combined with a leak in the convent's aging foundations, could have created the perfect breeding ground, causing a dormant patch to suddenly flourish and release a massive bloom of spores. The convent's isolation, its lack of frequent deep cleaning in the oldest sections, only exacerbated the problem. During their exploration of the convent's upper floors, Father Mateo noticed something else. The windows in the dormitory and chapel, though stained and grimy, were also heavily latched, some even nailed shut. The air in these rooms felt particularly stagnant, thick with the lingering cloying scent. He recalled the Mother Superior's strict adherence to tradition, her belief that the outside world was a distraction, and that the nuns should remain focused on their spiritual duties, minimizing contact with external elements. This strictness, meant to preserve piety, had inadvertently sealed their fate. With minimal fresh air circulation from the outside, the airborne spores had been trapped, concentrated within the convent walls, ensuring a prolonged and lethal exposure for the sisters. The realization was a crushing blow. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon, but a combination of natural forces and human choices. The nuns' isolation, their dedication to their cloistered life, and the Mother Superior's rigid interpretation of religious seclusion had created a perfectly sealed environment for the silent killer to work its slow, terrible magic. It wasn't malice, but a tragic confluence of circumstances, a fatal flaw in a seemingly innocuous design. The investigation continued for several days. Isabella meticulously collected samples of the fungus, carefully bagging them for later study and containment. Pedro and Miguel, though still uneasy, worked diligently to seal off the contaminated areas of the cellar, using lime and fresh soil to try and neutralize the insidious growth. The village, hearing reports of the poisonous plant found within the convent, remained terrified, but also felt a grim sense of understanding. The unknown was always more frightening than a tangible, even if horrific, truth. Father Mateo, however, carried a heavier burden. He found himself rereading the Mother Superior's diary entries, searching for any overlooked clues, any hint that the nuns might have suspected the true nature of their affliction. He saw their descriptions of whispers and dreams not as psychological decline, but as the slow, terrifying onset of their final sleep. He wondered if, In their fading consciousness, they had known the invisible enemy that was claiming them. Or if they simply succumbed to a peaceful, inexplicable drift into oblivion. The question haunted him. Did they feel fear in their last moments, or just a profound, irresistible weariness? The answer, he knew, would forever remain buried with them. The convent, once a place of spiritual solace, was now a monument to a silent, unseen tragedy. The sun still shone brightly over Andalusia, but the shadow of Santa Clara and the grim knowledge of its invisible threat would forever linger in the collective memory of the village. The horror was not in a supernatural entity, but in the subtle, deadly power of nature, combined with the unintended consequences of human isolation and tradition. With the primary cause of the nuns' demise identified, Father Mateo felt a grim duty to understand not just what happened, but why the convent's design had facilitated such a tragedy. The sealed windows and interconnected ventilation system, while seemingly innocuous, had proven fatal. He wondered about the convent's origins, its history, hoping to find some context for its peculiar architecture. He recalled old church archives in the larger city, a repository of historical documents and blueprints. He sent a new message, this time requesting detailed plans and construction records of the Convent of Santa Clara. Several days later, a dusty roll of parchment arrived, detailing the convent's original construction in the late 16th century. Spreading the brittle blueprints across his desk, Father Mateo studied them intently. The architect, a man named Don Esteban Rojas, was noted for his innovative approach to monastic design, often incorporating elements to enhance spiritual seclusion. As Father Mateo meticulously traced the ventilation shafts, he noticed a small, almost illegible footnote on one of the plans, tucked away in a corner of the cellar schematic. It was written in a faded hand, different from the main script. He squinted, trying to decipher the elegant cursive script. It was a warning, a cautionary note from the original builders, almost an aside. Care should be taken to ensure adequate external airflow, particularly in lower levels, to prevent accumulation of vapors from subterranean growths. The earth breathes, and not always with kindness. A cold wave washed over Father Mateo. The builders, centuries ago, had been aware of subterranean growths, likely molds or fungi common in damp old structures, and had understood the need for ventilation. But the warning was subtle, a footnote, easily overlooked or dismissed over centuries of renovations and changing priorities. It implied a historical awareness of issues that could arise from stagnant, subterranean air. He also found records of a significant renovation in the late 1700s, where several external windows in the dormitory and chapel were either sealed or made much smaller to enhance the sisters' spiritual focus and limit worldly distractions. It was a common practice of the time, meant to create a more introspective and isolated environment. What was intended as a spiritual aid had become a deadly trap. The convent, over time, had effectively been sealed from the very air that could have saved its inhabitants. Father Mateo spent hours poring over the documents, connecting the dots. The initial construction had acknowledged a potential environmental hazard. Later, well-intentioned but misguided modifications, driven by religious fervor and a desire for deeper seclusion, had unknowingly amplified that hazard. The humid climate of Andalusia, the ancient porous stone of the convent, the unkempt state of its deepest cellars, and the subsequent sealing of external air vents. A perfect, tragic storm of circumstances. He shared his findings with Isabella. She listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. So, the original builders had a rudimentary understanding of the risk, she mused. But over generations, that knowledge became diluted, perhaps dismissed as old wives' tales, while the desire for deeper spiritual isolation overshadowed practical concerns. Precisely, Father Mateo replied, a heavy sigh escaping him. It wasn't a sudden, malevolent act, but a slow, insidious accumulation of neglect and misguided intent. Each choice, seemingly minor at the time, contributed to the convent becoming a sealed chamber where the sleeper's bloom could flourish unchecked. The implications were profound. The tragedy of Santa Clara wasn't the result of a single evil deed, but a complex interplay of natural phenomenon, human oversight, and the very traditions meant to uplift the soul. It was a chilling reminder of how the pursuit of ideals, without careful consideration of their practical consequences, could lead to unforeseen disaster. The convent itself, built as a sanctuary, had, through an unfortunate series of events, transformed into a perfectly designed instrument of silent death. The understanding brought no comfort, only a deeper, more unsettling realization of the fragility of life and the intricate ways in which our environment can shape our destiny, even in the most seemingly benign of settings. The quiet tragedy of Santa Clara would forever serve as a somber testament to the invisible threads that connect past decisions to present realities, and how even the most noble intentions can pave the way for silent horrors. The summer weeks turned into a harsh autumn. The grim task of burying the 28 nuns of Santa Clara was completed. A somber procession led by Father Mateo, with the villagers watching from a respectful distance, their faces etched with a mixture of sorrow and lingering fear. The convent, now sealed off by order of the regional authorities, stood as a silent, decaying monument to the tragedy, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the olive groves. Father Mateo, though he had diligently reported his findings to the authorities, the identification of the sleeper's bloom, the detailed analysis of the ventilation system, and the historical records of the convent's modifications, found little official interest in the full complexity of the case. The regional governor's office, eager to quell public unease and avoid any perception of negligence, quickly declared the deaths a natural, albeit unusual, outbreak of a rare fungal affliction. The deeper implications of architectural oversight and misplaced monastic traditions were ignored, deemed too sensitive or simply irrelevant to the official narrative. This lack of deeper investigation by the authorities left Father Mateo with a profound sense of unease. He knew the full story was more intricate, more unsettling than a simple scientific explanation. It highlighted how easily truth could be simplified, how human choices could be overlooked in the face of a convenient singular cause. The mystery was officially solved, yet for Father Mateo, the weight of understanding the human element, the slow build-up of conditions that led to the tragedy, remained. Isabella, too, felt the lingering weight of the discovery. She continued her independent study of the sleeper's bloom, pressing samples between pages of old books, sketching its delicate structure in her worn notebooks. She recognized the immense, unseen power of the natural world, a power that could be both beautiful and terrifyingly destructive. The convent became a quiet laboratory for her, a place where she sought to understand the subtle nuances of nature's darker side. She provided Father Mateo with detailed notes on how to properly contain and eliminate the fungus, advising on the need for thorough aeration and the application of strong lime solutions to disinfect the cellar and walls. But her advice too was largely dismissed by officials who prioritized quick containment over thorough eradication. The village, however, lived with the convent's legacy in a more visceral way. The memory of the silent sleepers permeated their daily lives. The children sang morbid rhymes about the sleeping sisters, and mothers warned their daughters not to venture too close to the convent walls. The air, even miles away, sometimes seemed to carry a phantom whisper of that sickly sweet scent, a psychological imprint of the horror they had witnessed. Trust in the convent, once absolute, had been shattered. The idea of divine protection, seemingly violated within its own hallowed walls, left a profound scar on their collective psyche. Father Mateo spent his days trying to restore faith and calm. He preached sermons emphasizing the resilience of the human spirit, the importance of community, and the need to find strength even in the face of inexplicable tragedy. He emphasized that the evil was not supernatural, but a force of nature, and that vigilance and knowledge were their best defenses. Yet, he knew a part of the village's innocence had been lost, replaced by a lingering shadow of suspicion towards the unseen. One particularly cold, rainy evening, as the wind howled around his small rectory, Father Mateo received an unexpected visitor. It was old Miguel, the carpenter, his face pale and drawn. He carried a small wooden crucifix, his knuckles white around it. "Father," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear, I think I smell it again, that sweet smell. It's faint, but it's there, carried on the wind tonight." Father Mateo's heart sank. He knew Miguel was prone to anxiety, but the wind was indeed blowing from the direction of the convent. Had the sleeper's bloom, despite their efforts, begun to reassert itself? Or was it merely the lingering psychological impact, the trauma of the past, playing tricks on Miguel's mind? The official report stated the problem was contained, but Father Mateo had seen the shortcuts taken, the half measures. The true unsettling legacy of Santa Clara, he realized, was that the silent threat might not be entirely gone, merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to awaken once more. A chilling reminder that some mysteries, once unearthed, never truly vanish. If the lingering dread of Santa Clara has you hooked, make sure to subscribe to the channel for the final chapters of this harrowing tale. Remember, this is a fictional story. Miguel's fearful report of the lingering sweet scent sent a fresh wave of apprehension through Father Mateo. While he tried to reassure the carpenter, a seed of doubt had been planted in his own mind. The official cleanup had been cursory, and the convent, left untouched and unmonitored for months, could very well be a breeding ground once more. The autumn rains, particularly heavy that year, would only exacerbate any resurgence of the fungus. He visited Isabella the following morning, explaining Miguel's concerns. Isabella, who had been meticulously studying her samples of sleeper's bloom, nodded grimly. "It is entirely possible, Father. This fungus is incredibly resilient. If the conditions remain right, dampness, darkness, lack of proper airflow, it will return. The spores can lie dormant for a very long time, waiting for moisture to reactivate them." She picked up a delicate, dried sample of the fungus, holding it up to the light. "And the wind can carry them, even at great distances, especially when the air is heavy with moisture." The thought of the spores being carried on the wind, spreading beyond the convent walls, was a terrifying prospect. The village was close, and while a diffused concentration might not be immediately lethal, prolonged exposure could still be dangerous. The silence of the convent had been broken only by the whispers of the wind, and now those whispers carried a new, unseen threat. Father Mateo knew he couldn't rely on the authorities. Their initial dismissal of the deeper issues meant they were unlikely to revisit the case with the thoroughness required. This was a burden he and Isabella had to shoulder themselves. He gathered Pedro and Miguel once more, explaining the renewed potential threat. Pedro, ever practical, agreed to help reinforce the convent seals, but Miguel, haunted by the lingering scent, was more hesitant. "Father," Miguel said, his voice trembling, "what if it's already here, in the village? What if we are all breathing it in slowly, just like the sisters?" Father Mateo understood his fear. The psychological impact of the tragedy was immense. "We must be vigilant, Miguel. We must air our homes, keep them clean and dry, and we must seal the convent completely. It is our duty to prevent this from happening again." Their renewed efforts focused on securing the convent more thoroughly than before. They worked tirelessly, despite the biting autumn wind and intermittent rain, sealing windows and doors with fresh mortar, reinforcing the trapdoor to the cellar with iron bars. Isabella, braving the still eerie interior, carefully applied a stronger lime wash to the cellar walls, a more potent disinfectant than what had been used previously. The sweet, cloying scent, though faint, was still present in the lowest levels, a persistent reminder of its deadly potential. During their arduous work, Father Mateo began to notice subtle shifts in the village. A few villagers reported unexplained fatigue, a persistent cough, or a lingering sense of drowsiness. Old man Thomas, who lived closest to the convent, complained of strange, vivid dreams, disturbingly similar to those described by the Mother Superior in her diary. Dreams of endless falling, of a heavy blanket of darkness. While these could easily be attributed to the prevailing fear and the changing seasons, Father Mateo couldn't shake the chilling suspicion that perhaps Miguel's fears were not entirely unfounded. One evening, after a particularly long day of work at the convent, Father Mateo found a young orphan boy, Mateo, who often ran errands for him, sleeping soundly on a bench outside the church. It was unusual. The boy was normally energetic. When Father Mateo gently tried to wake him, he struggled to rouse, his eyelids heavy, his breathing shallow. It took several minutes for him to fully awaken, and even then he seemed disoriented, complaining of a terrible headache and an overwhelming desire to sleep. A cold dread seized Father Mateo. This wasn't merely fatigue. This was too reminiscent of the early stages described by the Mother Superior. He immediately took the boy to Isabella. After a thorough examination, Isabella confirmed his fears. His pupils are dilated, Father. His pulse is slow. These are consistent with initial exposure to the spores, particularly in a child whose respiratory system is more vulnerable. The sleeper's bloom was indeed spreading. The containment efforts had been too little, too late, or simply insufficient. The invisible threat had found a new pathway, carried by the very air they breathed, and it was now, slowly but insidiously, beginning to claim new potential victims in the village. The initial shock of the convent's tragedy had been replaced by a quiet, creeping terror that permeated the very atmosphere of their lives. The horror of Santa Clara was no longer confined to its silent walls. It had seeped into the heart of the community. The discovery that the sleeper's bloom spores were affecting villagers, particularly young Mateo, plunged Father Mateo and Isabella into a desperate race against time. The official inaction was no longer an annoyance, it was a grave danger. They had to act, and they had to act quickly, before the village succumbed to the same silent slumber that had claimed the nuns. Isabella, with her profound knowledge of local remedies, worked tirelessly to find a counter-agent. She theorized that while there was no true cure for the advanced stages of spore inhalation, perhaps certain strong expectorants and respiratory stimulants could help those with early symptoms. She brewed potent concoctions from local herbs, eucalyptus, thyme, and a rare pungent mountain root known for its cleansing properties. She instructed families to boil these herbs in their homes, creating thick, aromatic vapors that would hopefully clear the airways and stimulate breathing, combating the lethargy. Father Mateo, meanwhile, became a tireless advocate for change within the village. He abandoned his earlier caution, speaking with newfound urgency. He gathered the villagers, explaining the true nature of the threat. Not a curse, but a tangible danger carried by the air. He emphasized the importance of ventilation, opening windows, even in the cold autumn air, lighting fires to create drafts, and most importantly, sealing off any remaining points of ingress from the convent or other damp, dark areas. He even suggested moving livestock and food storage away from enclosed, poorly ventilated sheds, fearing the fungus might thrive there too. His sermons became less about abstract faith and more about practical survival, about collective action against an unseen enemy. He urged them to look after one another, to report any signs of drowsiness or persistent fatigue. Pedro and Miguel, now fully committed, became his lieutenants, helping to organize the sealing of houses and the distribution of Isabella's herbal remedies. The mood in the village shifted from passive fear to active vigilance, mixed with a palpable sense of dread. The air, once considered benign, was now viewed with suspicion. Children who normally played freely were kept close, their parents constantly monitoring their breathing and energy levels. The rhythmic boiling of Isabella's herbal concoctions filled the village with a strange medicinal scent, a new aroma that competed with the phantom sweetness of the sleeper's bloom. Despite their efforts, the insidious nature of the threat became painfully clear. Old man Tomas, whose dreams had grown more vivid and consuming, was found one morning in his bed, peacefully asleep, just like the nuns. His breathing was shallow, his pulse barely perceptible. Another victim silently claimed. His death, quiet and without struggle, served as a chilling reminder of the enemy they faced. It reinforced the terrifying reality that the initial symptoms were often subtle, easily dismissed until it was too late. The psychological toll on the villagers was immense. They lived in a constant state of low-grade anxiety, never knowing who might be next to succumb. Sleep, once a refuge, now felt like a terrifying gamble. Was it just a peaceful rest, or the beginning of the eternal slumber? The sound of wind outside their homes, once a gentle whisper, now seemed to carry a silent, deadly cargo. Father Mateo felt the weight of each new victim. He saw the doubt creeping into the eyes of some villagers, questioning whether even their desperate measures were enough. He knew that the only way to truly secure the village was to eradicate the source. The convent, despite their sealing efforts, remained a silent, festering wound, a constant source of spores. He approached Isabella with a grim determination. "Isabella," he said, his voice firm, "we must destroy it. The fungus completely. The authorities will not act with the urgency required. We must do it ourselves." Isabella, her face smudged with soot from her herbal fires, looked at him, her eyes tired but resolute. "How, Father? It is deep, extensive. We cannot simply burn the convent." "No," Father Mateo agreed, "but there are other ways. The villagers. We will need their help. We will need to go back into the cellar together, and this time we will not merely seal it. We will bury it, deep, until nothing can breathe there, not even the earth itself." The prospect was daunting, dangerous. Re-entering the cellar, facing the concentrated source of the sleeper's bloom, was a terrifying thought. But the alternative, watching his village slowly succumb to the same fate as the nuns, was even worse. The village, united by fear and a grim determination, faced its greatest test. The silent enemy had laid siege, and now they had to fight back with every ounce of courage and ingenuity they possessed. The plan was fraught with peril, but it was their only hope. Father Mateo, Isabella, Pedro, and a now resolute Miguel, along with a dozen of the bravest villagers, prepared for their final assault on the sleeper's bloom. Their weapons were not swords or guns, but shovels, picks, and immense quantities of quicklime, brought in secret from a nearby quarry. The goal was to literally bury the fungus, suffocating it beneath layers of lime and earth, severing its connection to the air that carried its deadly spores. The air that day was still and heavy, a stark contrast to the biting winds of recent weeks. It was a day of ominous calm. As they gathered at the convent gates, a palpable tension hung in the air. Each person wore a crude mask of damp cloth over their mouth and nose, saturated with Isabella's strongest herbal concoction, a desperate attempt to filter the air and stimulate their senses. Descending into the cellar of Santa Clara once more, the cloying, sweet scent was stronger than ever, a sickly, oppressive presence that clawed at their throats. The patches of sleeper's bloom on the walls seemed to pulse faintly in the lantern light, an almost malevolent presence. Fear was a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by a grim determination. Under Father Mateo's steady leadership and Isabella's precise guidance, they began. Pedro and Miguel, seasoned laborers, took the lead, carefully but quickly shoveling dry earth and then thick layers of quicklime onto the largest patches of fungus. The lime, a powerful desiccant, reacted with any moisture, generating a faint hiss and a fine dust that mingled with the existing spores, making breathing even more difficult. The villagers followed, moving with a desperate urgency, their shovels scraping against the stone floor, the only sounds breaking the chilling silence of the cellar. Hours blurred into an agonizing struggle. The air in the cellar grew thick with dust, and the acrid smell of lime mixing with the sweet fungal perfume. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes, but they pushed on, driven by the memory of the silent sleepers above and the faces of their own families in the village. Fatigue threatened to overwhelm them, but Father Mateo's unwavering voice, offering words of encouragement and prayer, kept them focused. Isabella, meanwhile, moved meticulously, using smaller tools to scrape away smaller, nascent patches of fungus in crevices and hard-to-reach areas, ensuring no living spore network remained. She understood the insidious resilience of the fungus, knowing that even a tiny patch left behind could eventually re-establish itself. As the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the landscape, they emerged from the cellar, exhausted, covered in dust and grime, but with a profound sense of grim accomplishment. The cellar was now buried under layers of earth and quicklime, its deadly growth smothered. They had then sealed the trapdoor with heavy stones and fresh mortar, ensuring no air could escape or enter the subterranean tomb. The last act was to seal the main convent building. They meticulously closed and barricaded every door and window, not just with wood, but with stone and mortar, effectively entombing the convent itself. Santa Clara, once a vibrant spiritual hub, was now a silent, impenetrable tomb, not just for the nuns within, but for the invisible killer it had harbored. The silence that had once brought fear now brought a measure of peace. In the days and weeks that followed, the air in the village slowly began to clear. The phantom sweet scent faded, replaced by the clean, crisp air of autumn. The unexplained fatigue and drowsiness among the villagers gradually subsided. Young Mateo, after weeks of Isabella's remedies and fresh air, slowly regained his energy and bright spirit. The psychological wounds, however, would take longer to heal. The memory of Santa Clara and the silent, insidious nature of its tragedy would forever remain etched in the collective consciousness of the village. Father Mateo watched his village slowly recover, a quiet triumph in the face of profound loss. The mystery had been solved, not by divine intervention, but by human perseverance, knowledge, and a grim determination to fight an invisible enemy. The convent, standing silent on the hill, was a stark reminder of the delicate balance between nature's power, human choices, and the devastating consequences when that balance is unknowingly disturbed. The 28 women of Santa Clara remained in their eternal slumber, but their story, one of an unseen horror and the resilience of a community, would forever echo through the sun-baked hills of Andalusia, a silent testament to a forgotten truth. This concludes the harrowing tale of the convent where 28 women were found sleeping and never woke. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel for more immersive and suspenseful narratives. Remember, this is a fictional story,